The road into Fairbank ran 9 miles along the middle loop, and on the 3rd Saturday of October in the year 1882, it carried more wagons than it had seen since the land office opened. Every one of them was going to the same place, and every one of them carried a woman with a box on her knees. That was the way of a church box social on the Nebraska prairie in those years. The women packed a supper into a wooden box or a hat box or a lard tin, and they covered it over with paper and ribbon and paint until nobody could tell whose was whose. And the men bid on them without knowing. And whatever a box brought went to the church, and the man who won a box got to eat that supper sitting beside the woman who packed it. Fairbank had a church with no bell. The frame was up, the roof was shingled, the stove drew well enough, but the belfry sat empty as a dry well, and Reverend Tobias Doak had told the congregation in August that a bell out of St. Louis, freight and hanging included, would come to $240. The box social was for the bell. Every woman in the county knew it, and every woman had been at her box for a week. Almira Stroud had been at hers for 9 days. She sat in the bed of her brother's wagon with her back against the sideboard and the box balanced on her lap, one hand flat on the lid the whole way in, the way a person holds a thing that has taken more out of her than she means to admit. She was 29 years old that autumn. She was a very large woman, and she had been all her life, and there was no soft way to say it, and she had long since stopped asking anybody to try. She stood 5 feet and 4 inches, and she weighed 311 pounds. She knew the number because Doss Kinnery had made her stand on the stock scale at the shipping pens 2 summers before, in front of 9 men, and had read it out loud in the voice a man uses for a joke he has been saving. She had stepped down off that scale without a word and walked the 3 miles home and had not eaten supper that night, and she had never once given Doss Kinnery the satisfaction of knowing either fact. She had a broad, plain face, a heavy chin, and hands that were wide across the palm and strong through the wrist, and those hands were the part of herself she had any pride in. They were the hands of a woman who had been keeping a house since she was 11 years old, when her mother died of a fever in Ohio and left her with a father, 4 brothers, and a kitchen. Her brother Josiah drove. He was a lean brown man of 34 who spoke about as often as the weather changed and who had never in his life said one unkind word to his sister, which is not the same thing as saying he had ever defended her. On the seat beside him sat his wife, Lavina, who was small and neat and quick, and who had been dreading this day since the notice went up on the store door. Lavina had said, the evening before, in a voice she believed was kind, that Almira did not have to come at all, that somebody had to stay and see to the stock, that nobody would think a thing of it. Almira had answered that she had been to every social since they came out from Ohio, and that she was going to this one, and that had been the end of it. And the 2 women had passed the whole of the ride into town with nothing but weather between them. The wagon crossed the plank bridge below the mill and came up the rise into Fairbank, and the town spread out the way it always did, smaller than a person remembered. There was the store, with Emmett Vane's name painted twice on it, once above the door and once on the side wall where nobody but the prairie could read it. There was the livery, and the harness shop, and the Grange Hall with its false front, and 2 saloons across from each other like a pair of men who have quarreled and will not move. There was the schoolhouse, and past the schoolhouse the new church, white as a shirt collar, with its empty belfry and the whole county's wagons drawn up around it in a horseshoe. Josiah set the brake. Lavina got down and was gone into a knot of women before her shoes had settled in the dust. Almira came down the tailgate the way she had learned to come down off a wagon in front of people, which is quickly, before anybody could get it into his head to help her, and she carried her box up the church steps with her chin level and her breath even, and she set it on the long plank table with the others. There were 41 boxes on that table. She counted them out of habit, the way she counted everything, and she looked at them the way a woman looks at a row of other women's work. There were boxes wrapped in blue paper and boxes wrapped in newspaper painted over with pokeberry juice, boxes with paper roses and boxes with ribbon bows, one built like a little house with a shingled roof. one covered all over in pressed autumn leaves. Hers was the biggest by a good deal, and it had to be, and she had known that when she built it. It was a clean pine box her father would have called a shipping crate, planed and sanded and rubbed with beeswax until the grain came up gold, and she had lined it inside with fresh muslin and covered the outside in butcher paper the color of cream. And on the lid she had done a wreath of oak leaves in real gold-brown paint that had cost her $1.10 at Vane's counter, which was money she did not have. Inside it was 9 days of work. There was a fried chicken cut and browned in a skillet and packed cold in its own jelly, and a stone jar of pickled crab apples, and a loaf of salt-rising bread wrapped in a napkin, and a wedge of yellow cheese from the Ostergaard's place, and a plum cake with a crumb on it she had learned from her mother and had never once got wrong, and 2 tin cups, and a folded cloth for a lap, and a bunch of dried everlasting flowers tucked down the side because the box would be opened in front of people and she wanted the first thing anybody saw to be something pretty. She had packed it for 2. She had packed enough for 2 grown people who had worked all day, because that was what a supper was for. The women along the table said hello to her the way people do when they are already turning away. Cordelia Doak, the preacher's wife, took her hand in both of hers and held it a second longer than the others, and Elmira liked her for it and was ashamed of needing it. Verna Kinnery looked at the size of the pine box and looked at Elmira and looked back at the box, and did not say anything at all, and that was worse than a word would have been. The Wicklow sisters, who were 19 and 20 and had brought 2 little boxes tied with the same pink ribbon, giggled at something that had nothing to do with anybody and everything to do with somebody. Elmira went and sat on the end of the 3rd bench on the women's side of the church and put her hands in her lap and got ready to be pleasant for 2 hours. It has to be said plainly, because it is the whole of what she carried, no man in that county had ever asked Elmira Stroud to walk out with him. Not once. Not to a dance, not to a picnic on the 4th, not down the length of the church aisle after a service. She had been in Fairbank 2 years and 8 months. In that time she had nursed the Bell children through a bad croup, sat up 3 nights with old Ferris Tull when his leg turned, doctored more sick calves than the veterinary surgeon out of Broken Bow, put up 400 quarts of garden truck out of the sod cellar behind Josiah's soddy, and taught 11 children their letters through a winter when the district could not pay a teacher. Everyone knew it. Everyone said it. And what everyone also said, when there was a fiddle going and the benches pushed back, was that Elmira Stroud was a fine woman and would make some man a wonder of a wife, and then everyone went and danced with somebody else. She had made her peace with it, or she had made the arrangement that people call peace. What she had not made her peace with was the way it turned into sport. It had started small, and it had grown the way a thing grows when there is nothing to check it. It grew in the saloons, where a man could get a laugh cheap by naming her, and it grew at the shipping pens, where Doss Kinnery had the scale, and it grew wherever Emmett Vane stood behind a counter with 3 men in front of him and time to fill. Vane was the storekeeper, and he was the auctioneer at every sale in the county, and he was the sort of man who had discovered early that a crowd will love you for a cruelty if you deliver it with a smile and a wink and call it fun. He was not a wicked man. That is the worst of it. He carried the Bell family on the books for 11 months when their crop failed, and he gave candy to children. And he would have been astonished and hurt to be told he had ever done anybody harm in his life. The church filled. The men came in last, as they always did, standing along the back wall with their hats in their hands and their boots scraping, smelling of horse and tobacco and cold air. Reverend Doak got up and said a word about the bell, and about the sound a bell makes carrying 9 miles over open country to a woman alone in a soddy, and everybody said amen. Then Emmett Vane came up beside the plank table and rolled his sleeves back and took a lead pencil out of his vest to use for a gavel, and the room settled the way a room settles when it is about to enjoy itself. and Elmira Stroud sat on the end of the third bench with her hands folded, looking at her own box among the 40 others, at the gold-brown oak leaves she had painted with a brush worn down to 9 hairs. And she let herself do the thing she had promised herself all week she would not do. She let herself hope. Emmett Vane could sell. That much was true of him, and nobody ever denied it. He held up the first box, a small square thing wrapped in blue with a paper bird on the lid. And he turned it in the lamplight and said that whatever was inside it smelled like a woman who knew what to do with a hen, and the room laughed easily and warmly, and the bidding started at 40 cents and ran to $1.80. He sold the little house with a shingled roof for $2.25 to a bachelor named Ott Prine, who went red to his collar. He sold the leaf-covered box for $3 flat, and there was a whoop when Cordelia Doak stood up to claim her place beside the buyer, because the buyer was Reverend Doak himself, and he had known his wife's handwriting on the corner of the paper, and everybody in that church had watched him cheat and loved him for it. The Wicklow sisters' 2 pink boxes went for $4 and $4.50, which was the high mark of the evening, and the 2 young men who bought them stood there grinning like colts while the whole county applauded. That was how it went, box after box, and the pencil in Vane's hand went up and down, and the money went into a lard pail on the table for a bell that would ring out over 9 miles of grass, and the church got warm and loud and good-natured, and it was, for about 2 hours, the happiest room in the state of Nebraska. Elmira watched the pile go down. That is a particular kind of arithmetic, and every woman who has ever waited on a table like that one knows it. 39 boxes left, then 31, then 20, then 11. She had let herself hope, and hope in a person of sense does not take the form of a daydream, it takes the form of a plan, and her plan was small enough to be nearly nothing. She thought that a man might bid on her box because it was a fine box, well-made and handsome, and that he might bid without knowing, and that when the paper came off and the muslin came back and there was that chicken and that plum cake and those everlasting flowers, he might sit down beside her on the church steps in the cold and eat, and that they might talk about the fall calving or the price of wool or anything at all, and that when the fiddle started, nobody in that room would be able to say she had sat the whole evening alone. That was the hope. It was a supper and a conversation. It was not a wedding, and it was not love, and she was too old and too practical to have asked for either of those out loud. 4 boxes left, 3, 2, and then it was hers on the table, and Emmett Vane put his 2 hands on it. He did not lift it. That was the first thing. Every other box he had swung up into the lamplight and turned like a jewel, and this one he set his palms on and left where it was, and he looked at it a moment, and then he looked out over the benches with the pleased and private look of a man who has just been handed a gift. Elmira felt it before it came. There is a change in the air of a room when a crowd understands that it has been offered permission, and she had lived inside that change often enough to know the feel of it on the back of her neck. Vane said, "Well now." He said, "Look here, what we've come to." He said the church had saved the best for last, and he ran one finger around the painted wreath of oak leaves like a man appraising a horse's teeth, and he said that this one had had some labor put into it, no question, that a body could not fault the carpentry, and one of the men at the back wall said something Elmira did not hear, and 4 or 5 around him snorted. Then Emmett Vane got his laugh. He straightened up and he hooked his thumbs in his vest, and he said, "Boys, I'd take a bid on it. But I want it understood before we start that it takes 2 men and a mule to get this one to the table." The church laughed. That is the plain fact, and there is no use dressing it. It was not a snicker, and it was not a cough behind a hand. It was the whole room, 60 or 70 grown people, and it came up all at once like a covey going off the grass, and it went on, and men slapped the back wall with their hats, and Dos Kinnery laughed until he had to bend over his knees, and a woman 2 benches ahead of Elmira laughed and then put her hand over her mouth and turned around to look at her. And that turning around was the part that Almira would still be able to feel in her chest 20 years later. Lavina did not laugh. Lavina looked at the floor, and her ears went scarlet, and she did not turn around, and she did not stand up either. Josiah went white about the mouth and stared straight ahead at the stovepipe and did not move, and his hands closed on his knees, and he did not move. Reverend Doak got half up out of his chair, and Cordelia's hand came down on his sleeve, and by the time he had decided what a preacher ought to do about a thing like that, it was already done and could not be undone. Because that is the nature of a laugh. And Almira Stroud sat on the end of the third bench with her hands folded in her lap and her chin level, and looked at her own painted oak leaves and did not cry, because she had made herself a promise about that in Ohio when she was 13 years old, and she had kept it every day since. Vane, having got what he came for, went on in fine humor. He asked for a bid. He said, "Come on now, boys, there's supper in here for a threshing crew." He said, "Whoever wins this one had better bring the wagon around." He said that a man could eat out of this box from now till Christmas and have some left over to feed his dogs, and there was another laugh at that. Smaller, uglier, the kind that comes from the few who are still enjoying it after the many have started to feel the room go wrong. And then Emmett Vane said, 40 cents. Do I hear 40 cents? Nobody said a word. He said, 30. Give me 30 cents, boys. It's for the bell. Nothing, he said, quarter. And there was a silence in that church of a quality Almira had never heard in her life, a silence with 70 people inside it, and the stove ticked, and out in the dark a horse shifted its feet in the traces, and somebody's harness chain rang once against a wagon tongue. And it went on. Vane, who was not a wicked man, understood by then that he had gone too far, and being that kind of man, his answer to having gone too far was to go a little further and get it over with, and he laughed and said, "Well, I guess nobody's hungry," and dropped his hand. 41 boxes had come up on that plank table that night, and 40 of them had sold. And nobody wanted the one with the oak leaves on it. That was the truth, and everyone in the room owned a share of it. No man would put up $0.25 to sit and eat a fried chicken beside her in front of the county, and it was not because of the chicken. And every soul under that roof knew exactly what it was because of. And the thing had been named out loud from the front of the church by a man using a pencil for a gavel. Almira sat still. She was aware of the particular heat in her face and the sound of her own blood and the fact that her hands, in her lap, had gone perfectly steady, which was what her hands always did. She thought, with a part of her mind that never stopped keeping house, that the chicken would do for Josiah's dinner pail Monday, and that the plum cake would keep 4 days in the cold cellar, and that she must not let anybody see her carry the box back out to the wagon. And that if she could get through the next quarter of an hour, she could get through the ride home, and if she could get through the ride home, she could get through the winter. Because that was the length of time she generally allowed herself to plan for. She was making that arithmetic when she became aware that the room had changed again. It had gone quiet in a different key. And a man's voice came from the back wall by the door. Not loud, not raised at all. A plain, flat voice with some Missouri left in it. And it said, $31. Emmett Vane's pencil stopped in the air. There is no describing what that number did to that church. The Wicklow girls' pink boxes had brought $4 and been the talk of the county. The whole evening's 40 boxes, all told, had made a little over $51 for the bell. And a voice at the back had just said $31 for a box nobody would bid a quarter on. 60 heads came around at once. He was standing against the back wall between the coat pegs and the water bucket, a man nobody in that room knew well, with his hat in his hand and his hair still showing the line where it had been under the brim. He was about 34, dark, weathered to the color of harness, not tall, thick through the shoulders and forearms in the way of a man who has been throwing rope and lifting since he was a boy. He had come into the country in July. He had bought the Hollis place, which was 240 acres of good grass with a broken windmill, a burned-out barn, and a mortgage that had killed two men's ambitions before his, and to keep it he was riding for the Kinnery outfit through the fall and winter at $31 a month and found. His name was Cade Merrow, and, until that moment, his entire standing in the county consisted of the fact that he had once ridden 10 miles in a rain to return a strayed heifer that nobody had asked him to look for. Vane got his voice back and made a joke of it, because that was the only tool he had in his hand. He said, $31. Do I hear a doctor? The boys took a fever. Two men laughed. Cade Merrow did not laugh, and he did not look at Vane at all. He said, I'll say it again if you didn't hear it. $31. And then he said the sentence that went around that county for the next 50 years, that got told in kitchens and at brandings and at wakes, that Cordelia Doak wrote out that same night in the flyleaf of her Bible where she kept the things she did not want to trust to memory. He said, I don't know whose box that is, and I don't care what's in it. I'm bidding on the week of work somebody put into painting those leaves. Emmett Vane sold it. There was nothing else he could do with the whole county watching, and he sold it fast and badly without any of his patter, and he brought the lead pencil down on the plank and said sold, and the sound of it was small. Cade Merrow came up the aisle. He had been paid on the first of the month, and he had not spent any of it, because he was a man saving toward a windmill, and he counted the money out onto the table in front of the lard pail in silver and paper, a 5, a 10, another 10, and the rest in coin, and it made a considerable heap, and when he was done he had 11 cents left in the world until the 1st of November. Reverend Doak said something about the bell in a voice that was not entirely steady. Then Vane, because a sale is a sale and the form has to be kept, pulled the butcher paper off the lid and lifted it, and the whole church leaned to see. There was the muslin lining, white as a wedding. There was the fried chicken in its jelly, and the crab apples in their stone jar, and the salt rising loaf, and the wedge of yellow cheese, and the plum cake with the crumb top, and the 2 tin cups set in their own little nests of cloth and down the side, where a person could not help but see them first, the dried everlasting flowers. Somebody in the middle of the church said, "Oh," out loud, the way a person does when a thing turns out to be beautiful. And Vane, still holding the lid, had to say the name, and he said it too quietly the first time and had to say it again. He said, Miss Almira Stroud. The room turned around, every face in it. She stood up because there was nothing else to do. She put her hands down at her sides, and she stood up on the end of the third bench in a gray wool dress with a white collar she had turned twice. 311 pounds of her in front of every person she knew in the world 4 minutes after they had all laughed. And Cade Merrow crossed the floor to her. That is the part Cordelia Doak wrote down. He did not wait at the table for the woman to be brought to him, which was the custom, and he did not stand there and grin, which was the other custom. He walked down between the benches with his hat in his hand until he was in front of her, and he was not a tall man, and she was not a small woman, and they looked at each other very nearly level, and he said, "Ma'am, I'm Cade Merrow from the Hollis place." He said, "I've got no manners to speak of, and I've been 6 years in a bunkhouse, so I'll ask it plain. Would you sit and take supper with me?" And Almira Stroud, who had been asked to nurse, to cook, to sit up with the dying, to teach, to bake, to doctor a heifer at 2 a.m, and never once in 29 years to sit down and eat beside a man in front of people, heard herself say, "I would." They took the box out onto the church steps, because the benches inside were being pushed back for the fiddles, and because neither of them, it turned out, wanted a roof. It was cold and clear, and the sky over the Lupa had that hard-scrubbed look it gets in late October, and Cade spread his coat on the top step for her, and she told him not to be a fool with a good coat, and made him keep it, and sat down on the boards, and he sat down beside her, and she opened the lid. She had packed for 2. She had packed for 2 grown people who had worked all day, and now there were 2, and she thought about that while she was laying out the cloth, and it made her hand slow for a second, and he did not notice, or he was good enough to pretend he did not. They ate. He ate like a man who had been eating bunkhouse beans since July, and he said so. And he said that the salt-rising bread was the first bread he had had in 5 months that had not come out of a Dutch oven tasting of the last thing cooked in it, and that a man could get religion off a plum cake like that. She asked him about the Hollis place. He told her the truth, which surprised her because most men out there told a woman a better version. He said the grass was as good as any in the county and the water was there if a man could get at it, and that the windmill was a wreck and the barn was a black ring on the ground, and the note at the bank in Broken Bow came due in 3 years, and that he was writing for Kinnery to make the payments and would be writing for somebody every winter until the place carried itself or killed him. He said he had come up from Missouri after his mother died, having no reason to stay and no money to go anywhere better. He asked her about Ohio. And she told him about the farm on the Scioto Bottom, and about her father Elias Stroud, and here she got going in a way she had not got going with anybody in the county in 2 years and 8 months, because Elias Stroud had been a man of trades and she had been his shadow. Her father, she said, had been a farmer 4 months of the year and everything else the other 8. He had burned hardwood for ash and leached the ash for lye, and boiled the lye down to potash and hauled the potash to Circleville in kegs. And he had made the soap for 4 families out of the same leach. And he had cut hope poles, and he had known how to draw a barrel stave, and he had made hominy every fall of his life in an iron kettle in the yard, enough to fill a hogshead, and pounded the dried corn in a burned-out stump with a maul on a spring pole, which he called a samp mortar, and which had been the first machine she ever loved. She had been 11 when her mother died, and after that she had done all of it at his elbow. She said, "I can tell you what wood makes strength in a leech, and what wood is a waste of a match." She said, "I can tell you to the hour when the hulls will slip." She said, "My father used to say that any fool can raise corn, and it takes a woman to make it fit to eat." And Cade Merrill listened to every word of that with his forearms on his knees and a chicken bone forgotten in his hand, and at the end of it he said, "Where I come from a man would pay to know half of that." She said it was not worth much on the loop. She said everybody out here grew wheat and hauled it to Deverell's mill and ate white bread and thought corn was for stock. And the only ash anybody made went out the stovepipe or got scattered on the garden. And that she kept a leech behind Josiah's soddy anyway, out of habit and stubbornness, and had made her sister-in-law 2 years of soft soap out of it, and that Lavina was ashamed of it because it was an old country way of doing, and she wanted store soap in a bar with a paper on it. Inside the church the fiddles started. They sat on the step and did not go in, and after a while he asked her whether she would want to dance, and she said, plainly, without any bitterness she could hear in her own voice, that she had never once been asked, and had long since quit standing where a man would have to walk past her to get to somebody else. And Cade Merrill looked out at the dark for a minute, and then said, "Well," he said, "I can't dance any better than I can talk." He said, "But I've got Sundays, and I'd like to spend one of them driving out to your brother's place, if that would be all right with you and him." She said it would be all right with her. She said Josiah would not have an opinion, and Lavina would have several. And that was the whole of it. That was the entire event. A man bought a box of supper for $31, which was every cent he had earned in the month of October in the year 1882, and he ate fried chicken on a church step in the cold with a woman the county had just laughed at, and he asked if he might come out on a Sunday. It ought to have been nothing. What it was, in fact, was the beginning of the story that saved the lives of a good many people in that county the following winter, though nobody could have known it then, least of all the 2 of them. The ride home was bad. Lavina held herself like a woman carrying a full cup on a rough road and got out 3 separate versions of the same sentence, which was that Almira ought not to encourage a man who had made a public spectacle, and that people were saying he had done it to shame Emmett Vane, and that a man who would throw away his month's wages in front of the county was not a man who would ever keep a place going, and that people were going to talk. Josiah drove and said nothing for 6 miles. Then, at the turn where the wagon road drops down through the draw, he said, without turning his head, that a man who would spend everything he had to keep his sister from being laughed at in a church was welcome at his table any Sunday of the year, and that if Lavina wanted to argue about it, she could do it with him and not with Almira. Nobody said anything the rest of the way. And Lavina was right about one thing, at least people talked. It went around Fairbank inside of 3 days, and it went around in both saloons, and it was told wrong every way it could be told wrong. There were men who said Merrill had been drinking, though he had not been. There were men who said it was a bet, that somebody had put him up to it for a joke on Vane, and that version was popular because it let everybody keep laughing. Dos Kinnery, who had the man's wages in his pocket every month, told it at the pens as a thing that proved the new fellow had no sense with money and would not last a year on the Hollis place. And Emmett Vane, behind his counter, with 3 men in front of him and time to fill, made a small, careful joke of the whole evening, and told it, and got his laugh, and told it again the next week, and got it again, and it settled into the county the way a stone settles into a field, and by Christmas there was hardly a soul in Fairbank who did not know the joke about the box that took 2 men and a mule. Cade Merrill came out to the Stroud place on the first Sunday of November, and on every Sunday after it that the weather allowed, which that fall was most of them. He came on a borrowed buckboard the first time, and after that on a rough-gated sorrel, because the buckboard had to be asked for, and he did not care to keep asking. He ate Sunday dinner at Josiah's table, and he was not much of a talker, and Lavina was frostily polite in the way that costs a woman more than it costs anybody else, and Josiah asked him about grass and water and got answers that satisfied him. Afterward, Cade and Almira walked, if it was fair, out along the section line to where the ground broke down to the river. And if it was not fair, they sat in the sotty's front room with the door open for propriety, and she mended while he sat with his hands hanging between his knees, and they talked about work, mostly because work was the language both of them had been raised in. He learned in that first month that she had a mind like a well-kept ledger. She could tell him what a windmill wheel of a given size would lift out of a given depth, because she had read it in a catalog and remembered it. She knew why his grass came in short on the north quarter, and it had to do with the way the snow drifted off the ridge and the ground froze bare there, and she was right. And he went and looked. In the 3rd week of November, he brought a wagon and helped her tear down the old leach behind Josiah's soddy and build her a proper one, because she had been talking about it since the church steps and he had been listening. That was the ash hopper, and half the county laughed at it before the winter was out, and every one of them came to it before the winter was over. It was not much to look at, which is the way with the things that matter. It was a wooden trough shaped like a V, 6 feet long, made of 2 planks pitched together and caulked with clay, set up on a frame of posts at the height of a man's waist, with a slope to it and a lipped board at the low end, and a groove cut so that whatever came out ran down into a tub sunk in the ground beneath. You laid a bed of clean straw and small sticks in the bottom of the V, and on that you packed your hardwood ashes down hard, wetting them as you went, and then you built up a lip of clay around the top, and you poured water in, and you waited. What came out at the low end, drop by drop, brown as strong tea, was lye. Almira Stroud had been making it since she was 11 years old, and she could do the whole business half asleep. And she taught Cade Merrill to do it that November afternoon in the cold, with her sleeves pinned back, and the 2 of them argued about the pitch of the trough, and she won. There were 3 things she knew about that leach that nobody else on the Middle Loop knew, and every one of them mattered before the spring. The first was the wood. Ashes are not ashes. Hardwood ash makes lye, and soft wood ash does not, or makes so little that a body wastes a week finding it out. On the Nebraska prairie in the 1880s there was cottonwood and willow along the river, and there was whatever a man hauled or bought. And cottonwood ash, as she said, would not eat the skin off a rice pudding. What you wanted was oak, hickory, ash, sugar maple, apple, hedge. In Ohio her father had had a whole woods of it. In Fairbank there was almost none of it standing, and that fact would become, in February, the most important fact in the county, though nobody would have believed it in November. The second thing was the test. There is no gauge for lie, and there never was one in a farmyard, and a woman who guesses at it either wastes her corn or spoils it. Elias Strout had taught his daughter 2 ways to know, and she used both. You floated a fresh egg in it, and if the egg came up and showed a circle of shell the size of a dime, that was strength. And if the egg sank, the lie was weak and had to go back through the ash again. And if the egg rode too high, the lie was too strong and had to be watered. And if you had no egg, you dipped a goose quill in it, and if the barbs of the feather melted off, you had it. She could tell nearly as much by the feel of it between her thumb and finger, which she said was a soapy slipperiness like a wet stone. But she never trusted a feel when an egg was to be had. The third thing was the corn, and it was the whole of it, and there was not a farmer in Fairbank who had ever heard of it or would have listened if he had. You take flint corn, the hard yellow field corn that a man grows for his stock and that is too hard for a woman's handmill and too coarse for anybody's stomach, and you put it in an iron kettle with water and a measure of that lye, and you boil it and stir it, and something happens that has nothing to do with fire and everything to do with what the lye does to the skin of the kernel. The hulls loosen. In half an hour to an hour, the hard flinty skin of every kernel slips off like a coat, and what is under it swells up white and soft and near about triples in size, and the taste of it changes altogether. Then you wash it. That is the labor, and there is no shortening it. You wash that corn in cold water and rub it between your hands and pour off the water and do it again and again 6 or 8 or 10 times until the water runs clean and there is no bite left in it at all. And what you have in the bottom of the tub is hominy. It will feed a man. It will keep a week in a cold cellar in its own water and all winter if you dry it. And if you dry it hard and pound it in a mortar, you have samp and grits and meal that any woman can bake with. A bushel of hard corn that a horse would have to work to chew comes out of that kettle as something a sick child can eat with a spoon. In Ohio, it was ordinary. Every family on the Scioto made it in the fall. On the Middle Loop, in the year 1882, in a county settled mostly out of Illinois and Sweden and Bohemia by wheatmen who bought their flour in a sack. There was exactly one person who had ever made it, and she was the woman they had laughed at in the church. That was the state of things when the year turned toward winter. It had been the biggest corn crop the county had ever grown. That was the joke of it, and nobody saw the joke until later. The rains had come right in June, and there had been heat in August, and the corn had made ears like a man's forearm, and every crib in the valley was full to the poles, and there was corn stacked in the fields under tarpaulins because there was no room. And the price at the elevator in Broken Bow had fallen to 11 cents a bushel, which was not worth the hauling. Men were burning it. That is a fact that people forget about those years. Corn at 11 cents made a cheaper fire than coal at $9 a ton, and there were kitchen stoves in that county that burned nothing all winter but ear corn out of the crib. Meanwhile, the wheat had gone the other way. The wheat had been thin and rusty, and there was not much of it. And what there was went to Deverell's mill on the river below town to be ground into the flour that Fairbank ate, and Vane's store carried the rest in barrels freighted in from the east on the railroad that came through the cut at Deacon Hill. So the county had a mountain of corn it considered worthless and a thin thread of flour it considered life, and it thought nothing of either arrangement, because that is how people think when the weather has been good. Almira thought about it. She thought about it in the way of a woman who had been raised by a man who could not look at a hillside without thinking what it might be persuaded to yield. She said to Cade one Sunday in the last of November, standing at the ash hopper with her hands wrapped in her shawl, that it made her low to see corn burned in a stove, that in Ohio a crib like Josiah's would have been 400 bushels of hominy and enough soap for a township. And Cade said, "Then make it." And she said there was no sense making a hogshead of hominy for a house of 3 that ate white bread, and that anyhow Lavina would not have it in the cellar because it was an old country way of doing, and that people out here would sooner eat a boiled shoe than a dish of hominy, because they had it in their heads it was poor folks' food. He said, all the same, I'd eat it. So she made a kettle of it that week, 1 bushel, to show him, and he came out on the Sunday and ate 2 platefuls with butter and salt, and said it was better than anything he had had out of the bunkhouse in 6 months. And Josiah ate a plateful, and allowed it was not bad, and Lavina ate 3 spoonfuls to be civil, and said nothing at all. And Elmira dried the rest on sheets in the cold sun, and put it up in 2 crocks and 1 flour sack in the sod cellar, and did not think about it again for 11 weeks. Word of the ash hopper got to town, because everything got to town. Nothing on a prairie is private. A man named Prine saw it from the road and mentioned it, and Emmett Vane asked what in the world the woman was building out there, and it was explained to him as well as a man could explain a thing he had not looked at. And Vane, who had a joke about her already and was fond of it, made a second one. He said she was laying up ashes the way other folks lay up potatoes. He said, "Boys, that woman is fixing to boil the whole county soap in one go." And the boys laughed, and it went around, and for a few weeks in December the story of Almira Stroud's ash hopper was a small standing amusement in Fairbank. A thing men mentioned when the talk ran thin, and nobody in either saloon or behind any counter in that town had the first idea what he was laughing at. The weather turned on the 18th of December, and it turned the way it does on that river, which is twice, and the second time in earnest. First came the warm. A wind came up out of the southwest on a Monday and blew 3 days and nights at the temperature of April, and the snow that had lain since Thanksgiving went off the grass in a morning, and the ground gave underfoot, and men walked around in their shirt sleeves in the middle of December, telling each other that this was the mildest winter in the history of the country, and that a person could grow oranges out here if he had the sense to try. Water stood in every buffalo wallow. The middle loop came up under its ice, and the ice on it broke and heaved and went down in flows on the flood, the way it does in March, and piled against the piers of the plank bridge below Fairbank and against the low bank at the bend where Deverell had his mill. And there it stopped, because at the bend the river runs shallow and wide over gravel, and there was not water enough under those flows to carry them on. That was the Wednesday. On Thursday afternoon the wind came around into the north, and the temperature went down 41 degrees between 3 in the afternoon and midnight, and it kept going. The country froze standing up. It froze, with the water still spread out over the low ground, and the ice piled at the bend. And it froze that whole raft of broken floes into one mass 1/4 of a mile long, and in places 9 feet thick, an ice gorge. And every farmer who saw it in the morning said what men always say, which was that it would go out with the next thaw. It did not go out with the next thaw. There was no next thaw. What there was, beginning on the 22nd of December in the year 1882 and lasting without one full day of mercy until the 11th of March, was the hard winter that the old people in that county were still measuring other winters against 40 years later. It never got above 0 for 19 days, running in January. The loop froze to the gravel in the shallows, and the springs that fed the wells went slow, and some of them stopped. And when the ice gorge finally moved, on the 2nd of January, it did not move gently. A break-up stream sent it, and it came down through the bend in the night with a noise the Ostergaards heard 3 miles off and thought was thunder in the wrong season. And it took the plank bridge out entire, piers and stringers and decking, and carried it a half-mile downstream and stood it up on end in a field, and on its way past it walked into the mill. Deverell's mill was the only grist mill within 26 miles. It was a frame building on a stone foundation with an overshot wheel and a dam of cribwork and stone. And Ivar Deverell had ground the wheat of that valley for 11 years and taken his toll in flour and been reasonably honest about it. The gorge went through his dam like a boot through a hen coop. It broke the cribwork out of the middle of it and dropped the head of water in a single night, and it caught the wheel and twisted the shaft. And when the men got down there in the morning, what they had was a mill house standing sound, and empty on a stone footing, with no dam, no head, no wheel worth the name, and a main shaft bent into an S that could not be straightened this side of a foundry in Omaha. Deverell stood in his own yard in the cold and looked at it and said, plainly and correctly, that there would be no meal ground on that river before June. Nobody was frightened yet. That is the thing about a hard winter, and everybody who has lived through one knows it. It does not arrive. It accumulates. Fairbank lost its bridge and its mill in one night and treated the matter as an inconvenience and an item of news, because the railroad still came through the cut at Deacon Hill, 11 miles east, and Emmett Vane's store had flour in barrels and would have more on Thursday's freight, and if a man could not grind his wheat, he could buy his flour, and there were 400 bushels of corn in his crib to burn in the stove while he did it. They were rich. That was the fact of it. Every family in that valley was sitting on more raw food than it could eat in 3 years, and it did not know that it was hungry, because none of that food was in the shape that people had made up their minds to eat. And Almira Stroud, 3 miles out on the Stroud place, spent the week of the freeze doing what she did every week, which was work, and thinking, in the back of her mind where a woman keeps the thoughts she has no use for yet, about her ash hopper standing out there under a foot of snow with a tub of good brown lye frozen solid in the ground beneath it, and about 2 crocks and a flour sack of dried hominy in the sod cellar, and about the fact that she had exactly 9 sticks of hardwood left on the place. Cade Merrill rode over on Christmas Day with a paper of coffee and a tin of oysters he had gone without something else to buy, and they ate goose at Josiah's table, and after dinner he stood with her in the cold at the door and said that he had been thinking, and that he would say the rest of it in the spring when he had a windmill and a barn and something better than a bunkhouse wage to say it on. And Almira Stroud, who had had $1.30 $1 bid and 1 supper on a church step and 8 Sundays out of a whole life, said that she was not a girl, and that spring was a long way off, and that if he had a thing to say he had better say it while they were both still in the habit of telling each other the truth. So, he said it. He said, "I want to marry you." He said it out there in the cold with his hat in his hand for the 2nd time in her life, and she said yes, and neither of them told anybody, because she said the county had had one thing to laugh about at her expense that autumn and could wait its turn for another. The county, as it turned out, was going to be busy. The first freight to miss came on the 28th of December. The Deacon Hill Cut is a 1.5 miles of railroad grade dug through a long rise, with banks that stand 20 feet above the rails at the deepest part, and it fills with snow in a north wind the way a trough fills with water, and it had filled before, twice in 11 years, and each time a plow and a section gang had cleared it in a day and a half. This time the north wind did not stop. It blew, with 2 brief lulls, for 9 days. And it did not bring much new snow after the first day, because there was not much left to bring. But it moved what was already down on 400 square miles of open country, and it put a good part of it into that cut. The section gang worked from the east side with a plow engine and got 2/3 of the way through on the 4th of January and were stopped by a drift that the plow rode up onto and stuck in, and while they dug the engine out the wind, put back in 11 hours what they had taken out in 3 days. On the 9th of January, the railroad gave it up until the weather broke and told the county so in a notice tacked to the door of the depot at Broken Bow, and there was no train through Deacon Hill in either direction from the 28th of December until the 14th of March. 11 weeks. That was the arithmetic that nobody in Fairbank did in January, because a man does not do that arithmetic while there is still flour on the shelf. What Emmett Vane had in the store when the last freight came through was 11 barrels of flour, 200 pounds of sugar, 60 pounds of coffee, a hogshead of salt, some dried apples, a few boxes of soda crackers, and the ordinary run of dry goods, and he had ordered heavy for the new year. And every bit of what he ordered sat in a boxcar on the far side of a 1.5 miles of packed snow for 11 weeks. Fairbank and the country around it came to something over 240 souls, counting the outlying claims and the 2 sod schoolhouses. 11 barrels of flour is not a great deal among 240 people. And Vane, to be fair to him, saw it before most and began rationing on the 15th of January, 10 pounds to a family and no more, and then 5, and he wrote it in his book and gave it out on credit to anybody who asked and never once turned a child away from the counter, and by the 8th of February he had a store with a great deal of calico in it and no bread of any kind. There was still wheat in the county. There were bins of it on 11 or 12 places. But there was no mill on the river, no bridge to get to the North Road, and no railroad to take it anywhere or bring flour back. And a bin of hard red wheat in a granary is not food any more than a fence post is a house until somebody grinds it, and there was not a burr mill in Fairbank bigger than the little iron hand mills the Bohemian families had brought over, which will grind 2 quarts an hour if a strong person turns the crank, and a good deal less after the first hour, and there were 4 of those in the whole valley. February in that valley was corn. There is no other way to describe it. Every crib was full, and every stove was burning ear corn for want of coal, and every family in the county was eating corn 3 times a day in the 4 or 5 shapes that people who have never been taught anything else can put corn into, and none of those shapes was good enough, and by the middle of the month it was beginning to show on the children. They boiled it whole. Hard flint corn boiled whole. Hours and hours of it comes out of the kettle as something that a grown man with sound teeth can chew if he has nothing else and is not particular, and it goes through a person nearly the way it went in. They parched it in a skillet until it cracked and ate it by the handful, and it was hot, and it tasted of something, and it left the mouth raw. They ground it, and this was the labor that broke people that winter. There were 4 little Bohemian hand mills in the valley, and they ran day and night, and 2 of them cracked their burrs by the end of January. After that, the women ground corn in coffee mills. A coffee mill will do about a pint an hour of hard flint corn if a person keeps at it, and it takes better than 3 pints of meal a day to keep one family in bread and mush. So there were women in that county who spent 9 and 10 hours a day sitting with an iron coffee mill between their knees turning a crank. And their hands went first, and their shoulders after, and Cordelia Doak went to see the Bell place on the 9th of February, and found Ida Bell asleep, sitting up with thee. Mill still in her lap, and her palms bloodied through her mittens. Some of them pounded it instead in a bucket with the end of a fence post, and that gives you cracked corn and hulls and grit, and the grit is in every mouthful of everything for the rest of the winter, and it wears people down in a way that is difficult to explain to anybody who has not eaten it. The hulls were the worst of it. That is the part the histories leave out. The skin of a flint kernel is nearly indigestible, and a diet of coarse-ground, unhulled field corn, week after week, with no wheat and no milk to speak of because the cows were down to nothing on prairie hay, will make grown people sick and will make small children sicker. Dr. Ansel Prue, who covered 4 townships out of Broken Bow and got over to Fairbank twice that winter on a borrowed horse, wrote in a letter that spring that in 11 years of practice he had never seen so much bowel trouble in one valley in one season, and that he had seen sore mouths and swelled gums in children in 9 families, and lassitude in grown men that he could not account for by any illness he knew, and that the whole trouble, in his opinion, was that a rich farming county had been reduced to eating stock feed in its crudest form for 2 months, and did not know there was any other way to eat it. That letter got printed in a state paper the following year, and a professor at the Agricultural College wrote a reply saying much the same thing in longer words. And neither of those 2 men ever knew that by the time the letter was written the thing had already been fixed 3 miles out of Fairbank by a woman with a kettle and a wooden trough. Nobody was starving. It is important to be exact about this, because the people who told the story afterward were sometimes not exact, and it made the truth harder to believe. There was food. There was more corn in that county than the county could eat in 3 winters, and there was beef for those who would kill a beef, and there were a few hogs, and there was some milk and some eggs. What there was not, from the first week of February on, was anything a body could get real strength out of, or anything a sick child would keep down, or anything that tasted like it had been made by a human being for another human being to enjoy. There is a kind of hunger that comes from an empty crib, and there is another kind that comes from a full one, and the second kind gets less written about and does its own damage. People stopped visiting. That was the sign Cordelia Doak said she noticed first. Attendance at the church fell to 9 on the last Sunday of January and did not recover. Nobody had anything to bring, and nobody had the strength to spare, and there is a shame that settles on a farming people when they are eating like their own stock, and it makes them shut their doors. They tried things. They tried a great many things, and the trying is the part that ought to be remembered, because the men of that valley were not fools, and they were not idle. On the 22nd of January, Doss Kennery and 4 others took 2 wagons and 8 horses and started for Broken Bow, 26 miles, to bring back flour. They got 11 miles in a day and a half, and past the low ground the drifts stood higher than the horses and were crusted hard enough to walk a man and not hard enough to hold a team. And one of the horses went down through the crust and cut both forelegs badly on the edge of it and had to be led home at a walk, and they came back with nothing. On the 30th, 3 younger men went afoot and on snowshoes made of barrel staves and got to Broken Bow in 2 days and found the town in nearly the same case, because Broken Bow was fed by the same railroad. And they came back over 4 days with 60 pounds of flour on their backs between them, which is worth remembering as an act, and which fed the valley for something under 1 meal. On the 4th of February, a committee went down to the mill and spent 9 days trying to get Deverell's wheel to turn on a temporary crib of ice and brush, and got it to turn twice, both times briefly, and then broke the bent shaft off short and finished the mill for good. Ott Prine built a horse-powered mill out of 2 wagon wheels and a set of burrs off a broken hand mill and a sweep, and it worked, in a fashion, and ground 11 pounds an hour with a horse walking a circle, and it was the best thing anybody in Fairbank did that winter, and it was not nearly enough. And the meal it made was the same unhulled grit as all the rest. What no man in that valley tried, and what not one of them thought of, was the thing that any farm wife in Ohio or Kentucky or Tennessee would have named inside of a minute. Because it had been done in this country for 200 years, and had been done on this continent for a great deal longer than that, by people the settlers of Fairbank did not think to ask. There is no mystery about why they did not think of it. Lie hominy was a southern and an eastern way of doing. It was old country to the Bohemians and no country to the Swedes, who had their own ways with rye and none with maize. The men of Fairbank had come out of the Illinois wheat belt in the 70s with a wagon and a plow and the idea that corn was a thing you sold or fed to a hog. They had heard the word hominy the way a person hears the name of a town he will never visit. And when they were hungry in a county with 400,000 bushels of corn standing in the cribs, every single one of them tried to solve the problem by turning corn into flour, because flour was the shape of food in their minds, and there was no mill, and so there was nothing to be done. Almira Stroud knew what to do on the first day of February. That ought to be said plainly, too, because people afterward like to tell the story as though the answer came to her in a flash in the middle of the worst of it, and it did not. She had known since November. She had made a kettle of hominy in November to show a man she was fond of, and there were 2 crocks and a flour sack of it dried in Josiah's sod cellar, and she had eaten it herself all through January while the county chewed its stock feed. And Josiah had eaten it, and by the 2nd week of February Lavina was eating it too, and had quit having opinions about old country ways of doing. What Elmira did not know was how to make a county listen. She was 29 years old. She was a very large woman in a place where that was understood by everybody to be a species of failure. She had, that winter, precisely one thing standing to her credit in the public mind of Fairbank, and it was that a strange rancher had once spent his wages on her supper box in a way that had made a good story in both saloons. When she stood up in a room, Men looked at her body and settled their faces into the expression they kept for her, and she had watched them do it 100 times, and she had never in her life found the trick of making them stop. She told Kate about the hominy on the 6th of February, standing at the sod cellar door with a lamp, and he was up to his elbows in the crock inside of a minute and eating it cold with his fingers like a boy. And he said, "Almira, this is the whole thing." And she said, "I know it is." And he said, "Then tell them." And she said, "Tell them how." And that was the argument the two of them had, off and on, for the next 11 days. The meeting was called for the evening of the 17th of February at the schoolhouse, because the church had no stovewood left and the school had a corn burner. It was called by Reverend Doak, and it was announced as a meeting to consider the relief of the county, and it drew better than 40 men and about half that many women, which was more people than had been in one room in Fairbank since the Bach Social. They came in on foot and on horseback over 4 miles of drifted country in a cold that took the breath out of a person at the door, and they stamped and sat down on the school benches with their knees up under their chins, and the room smelled of wet wool and corn smoke. And Almira Stroud came in with Josiah and Lavina and sat down at the back on the end of a bench, which was where she had sat in every public room of her life. They talked for 2 hours and a quarter. Das Kinnery said that the thing to do was to send 4 men with the best horses in the county down the river ice to the east, because the ice on the loop was better going than the road, and a man could make St. Paul in 3 days, and there was a railroad there that ran the other line, and the meeting liked that until Ivor Deverell pointed out that the gorge had left the ice below the bend broken and stood on edge for 1.5 miles, and that no horse alive would cross it. Ott Prine said he could build a second sweep mill if he had another set of burrs, and was asked where the burrs were coming from, and had no answer. A man from the North Tableland said that the government had corn at the agency and might be got to sell some, and it was pointed out that they had corn, that corn was the one thing on earth they did have, that a man could stand in the door of any crib in the county and be buried in the stuff, and that the trouble was not corn, but bread. Emmett Vane said that his order was sitting in a boxcar at Deacon Hill, and that the railroad had promised the plow again as soon as the wind laid, and he said it in the voice of a man who has said the same thing every week for 6 weeks and knows it is worth nothing. Dr. Prue was not there. He had sent a note to be read, and Reverend Doak read it. And it said that there was sickness in 9 families that in his judgment came from the food, and that he recommended, if any person had it, milk for the youngest children, and that he recommended above all things that the corned beef got rid of its hulls before it was eaten, though he confessed he did not know by what means that was to be managed in a farm kitchen. That note was read out loud to 42 men in a schoolhouse. Almira sat at the back of the room with her hands in her lap and heard the words "got rid of its hulls" read out in the preacher's voice, and she felt her heart go up into her throat, and she waited for somebody to say something. Nobody said anything. The note passed on to the next paragraph, which was about ventilation, and the meeting moved on to whether the district could pay a man to keep a road open, and that was the moment, and she let it go by. She let 2 more go by after it. Then Cade Merrow, who was standing along the wall with the other men who worked for wages and had no vote in a meeting of property holders, looked across the room at her and did not say a word and did not need to. And Almira Stroud put her hands on her knees and stood up. A woman standing up in a county meeting was not the ordinary way of things, but it was not unheard of either, and the room turned around good-naturedly enough at first. She said, "Reverend, if I might say something to the doctor's letter." Doak said, "Of course, Miss Stroud." And she said it. She said that the hulls could be got off the corn, and that she knew how, that her father had taught her the whole of it in Ohio, and she had done it every fall of her life until she came out here, and that it wanted 3 things and no more: hardwood ashes, an iron kettle, and water. She said you leach the ashes to make lye, and you boil the corn in weak lye a half hour to an hour, and the hulls slip off it whole, and then you wash it in cold water 8 or 10 times until it is sweet, and what you have then is hominy, and it swells to near 3 times its bulk, and it is soft enough for a baby and strong enough for a man in a hayfield, and it will keep a week wet in a cold cellar and all winter dried, and dried and pounded it makes samp and grits and a meal that will bake. She said that 1 bushel of the corn they were burning in their stoves would come out of the kettle as more than 2 bushels of food, and that there was corn enough in this valley to feed every soul in it until August without a pound of flour or a turn of any mill. She said, "I have got 2 crocks of it in my brother's cellar right now, made in November, and my family has been eating it all winter. And I will bring it in here tomorrow so anybody can taste it." She said all of that plainly and in order, and it took her not quite 2 minutes, and it was, from the first word to the last, exactly correct. There was a silence of about 4 seconds. Then a man near the stove said, "Lie." He said it the way a person says the name of something in a bottle with a skull on the label, and he laughed, and 2 or 3 around him laughed, and a woman said, "Oh, you'd never." And the room came apart into that low buzzing that means a proposition has been decided against before it has been considered. Das Kinnery said, out loud, over the noise, that his mother had told him lie would eat a man's stomach out, and that he was not going to poison his children on the say-so of anybody. Somebody said, "Is that what she's been laying up all them ashes for?" And there was a laugh at that, and it was a bigger one, because that story was already in the county and everybody had it. And then Emmett Vane, who was not a wicked man, who had carried 9 families on his book that winter and had not slept properly since January, who was tired and beaten and standing in a schoolhouse where a woman had just explained to him in 2 minutes a thing he had failed for 6 weeks to solve, reached for the only tool he had ever had in his hand. He said, "Boys, I don't doubt she can cook it." He said, "But you seen the size of the box she packs." He said, "If we all eat what Almira Stroud eats, this county is going to need 2 men and a mule apiece just to get us to the table." And the schoolhouse laughed, not all of it. Cordelia Doak said afterward that she thought about 1/3 of the room laughed, and another 1/3 smiled and looked at the floor, and the rest sat still, and that in a room of 60 people, that is enough. That 1/3 of a room laughing is the same as a room laughing when you are the one standing up in it. It went on some seconds. Josiah Stroud came up off the bench with his fists shut, and Lavina caught his coat with both hands and held on, and afterward she could never explain to herself why she had done it. Cade Merrill started along the wall toward the front of the room with a look on his face that 2 men who saw it described in the same words, which were that he looked like a man going to work, and Almira, who was still standing, put her hand out to the side, not looking at him, just her hand out flat, and he stopped where he was, because she knew what he was going to do, and she knew what it would cost him. He would have gone up there and taken hold of Emmett Vane in front of 40 men, and Vane was 51 years old and carried the county's credit in his book, and every man in that room owed him something, and Cade Merrill was a bunkhouse hand with a mortgaged quarter section who had already been marked down as a fool over a supper box. And if he laid a hand on the storekeeper, he would be finished in that valley, and so would she. So she put her hand out and stopped him, and she stood there and let the laugh get to the end of itself, which took 11 or 12 seconds, and she said, in a voice that was not loud and did not shake, that she would say it once more so that nobody could tell himself afterward that he had not heard it. She said, "The corn in your cribs is food." She said, "I know how to make it food, and I will show any woman in this county how, and it will cost her nothing but ashes and water and work." She said, "When you want it, I am 3 miles out on the section line north of the ford, and my door is not locked." Then she picked up her shawl and went out, and Josiah and Lavina went out behind her, and the schoolhouse went on with its meeting and voted $11 for keeping the road open and adjourned at 9:30. Nobody came to her door the next day. Nobody came the day after that. She had told the truth in a public room and been laughed at for it, and the county went home and ate its cracked corn and its hulls, and there is a version of this story in which that is the end. And there are a great many true stories that end exactly there and never get told because nobody wants them. What happened instead was that Almira Stroud got up on the morning of the 19th of February, in the dark, and lit the lamp and stood in the middle of the kitchen with her arms folded and said out loud to the empty room, "Well," and she went and got the wash boiler. There were two ways to look at what Almira Stroud did over the next 4 days, and the county eventually looked at it both ways, but at the time it was simply work, done alone in a soddy yard in weather that took the feeling out of a person's hands in 10 minutes. By a woman who had decided that if nobody would listen to a sentence, they might be persuaded by a bucket. The first thing was fire, and fire meant hardwood, and hardwood on the Middle Loop in February of 1883 was scarcer than money. She had 9 sticks of oak left from a wagon box Josiah had broken up in the fall. She went out that morning with the sled and took down 40 rods of dead hedge along the old Hollis line, which is Osage orange, which is the hardest and best fuel that ever grew on that prairie and which makes an ash so strong it will bite a bare hand, and she cut it herself with a buck saw for 2 days, with her breath freezing on the wool over her mouth, and Josiah quit hauling hay at noon on the first day and came and worked beside her without being asked and without saying anything about it. She burned it in a pit behind the sod cellar where the wind could not scatter what she wanted, and she kept the ash white and clean and out of the snow, and by the evening of the 21st she had better than 11 bushels of hardwood ash under a tarpaulin. And her face and hands were the color of a chimney, and Lavina heated water 3 times that night without a word. Then the leach. She thawed the tub, packed the V of the trough with straw, and then with the ash, wetting and treading it down hard with a maul the way her father had taught her. Because loose ash will let the water run through too fast and give nothing but gray water for a day's work. She built the clay lip and poured warm water at the head end, a pail at a time, all through the afternoon, and left it. It came at 3 drops to the second by evening and slowed after that, and she got a tub and a half in the night, and it was the color of strong tea in the lamp, and when she went out at 4 in the morning to look at it, she took an egg with her out of her apron pocket. The egg sank. That was the first failure, and she had expected it, because ash from woodcut grain and burned in a cold pit is never the equal of ash off a summer woodpile, and she poured the whole tub back through the hopper a second time, which is a labor of 2 hours in the dark, and set the egg on it again at 7 in the morning, and this time the egg came up and stood with a circle of shell showing about the size of a dime. She said, out loud, "All right," and then she washed her hands, which is the part that people always leave out of the story, and it is the part that says the most about her. She washed and dried her hands and put on her second apron and went in the house and combed her hair. Because a woman who is about to make food for other people does not do it in a state, no matter what the weather is doing outside. And Lavina watched her do it and said nothing, and later said that it was the moment she understood what kind of woman had been living in her house for 2.5 years. The kettle was Lavina's wash boiler, and it held 21 gallons. Almira put in 11 gallons of water and half a gallon of the lye and a bushel of shelled flint corn, and built her fire and stood over it with a wooden paddle from 7:30 in the morning, and stirred and watched. That is the whole art, and it cannot be written down in a way that saves anybody the trouble of learning it. Too little lye or too short a boil, and the hulls stay on, and the corn is nothing but corn. Too much lye or too long, and the kernels go soft and yellow at the middle, and the whole batch has a slippery bitterness that no amount of washing will fetch out, and a bushel is spoiled, and in that February a spoiled bushel was a real loss. You watch for the color to come up, a deeper yellow, almost orange. You take a kernel out on the paddle and blow on it and rub it between your thumb and finger and see whether the skin rolls off in one piece like a coat, and when it does, and when the black tip end of the kernel comes away too, you are done, and you had better be quick about it. Her first batch went too far. She had it perfect at 50 minutes and misjudged the fire and let it run to 1 hour and 10, and she knew it before she had it off, and she washed it anyway, all 10 washings, in cold water in a tub in the yard, with her sleeves pinned back and her hands going numb, rubbing the corn between her palms and pouring off and drawing more water from the well. And at the end of it she tasted it, and it was slick and bitter at the back of the tongue, and she threw the whole bushel out to the hogs, and stood a minute, and then went and got the second bushel. The second batch was right. It came off at 55 minutes, with the hulls floating loose and the kernels swelled to twice what had gone in. And she washed it 8 times, and rubbed it, and washed it twice more for good measure. And when the water in the tub ran off clear, and the corn in her 2 hands was white and plump and squeaked when she rubbed it, she stood in that yard at 4 o'clock in the afternoon in the cold, 311 pounds of her, with her sleeves wet to the elbow and her arms aching to the shoulder. And she put a kernel in her mouth and chewed it, and it was sweet. She carried in a milk pan of it and set it on the table, and got out the last of the salt pork and cut it into a skillet, and fried the hominy in the drippings with salt and a little of the sorghum Josiah had traded for in October, and the smell of it went through that soddy the way a bell goes through a valley. And Josiah came in from the barn without being called, and the 3 of them sat down. Lavina Stroud ate 1 bowl, and then a second, and part-way through the second she put her spoon down and put both hands over her face and cried, and she was not a woman who cried. She had been grinding corn in a coffee mill 9 hours a day for 5 weeks. She had a boy of 2 years old who had not kept a full meal down since Candlemas, and had gone quiet in the way that frightens mothers worse than crying does. She sat at that table and cried with her hands over her face, and then she wiped her face with her apron and said, "Almira, how much is there?" And Almira said, "There is 400 bushels in the crib, and there is another 1,100 within 2 miles of this door, and there is ashes wherever there is a hedgerow." And Lavina said, "I mean, how much have you got made?" And Almira said, 1 bushel. Made today, better than 2 bushels of food. And Lavina Stroud, who had wanted store soap in a bar with a paper on it, who had been ashamed of the ash hopper in her own backyard, who had told her sister-in-law in October that nobody would think a thing of it if she stayed home from the social, stood up from that table and took down a crock and put a lid on it and set it in the wash basket. And she said, "Ida Bell's hands are bleeding." She said, "I am taking this over there tonight, and I am telling her exactly how it is made, and if Ida Bell tells the Krupas, and the Krupas tell the Ostergaards, then let them laugh in the schoolhouse." And she said, "And if that man Vane says 1 word about the size of anything in my hearing again, as long as I live, Josiah, I will go over that counter myself." Josiah hitched the team at 7 o'clock at night in 11 below zero, and drove his wife 2.5 miles to the Bell place with a crock of hominy in a basket wrapped in a quilt, and Almira stayed and set the leach going again for the next day, because she had already worked out in her head what was coming and how much ash it would take. Ida Bell put a spoonful of that hominy into her youngest, who was 4, at 8:30 that night, and the child ate the whole bowl and asked for more, and Ida Bell stood in her own kitchen and watched him eat it, and then went and sat down on the edge of the bed in the other room where her husband could not see her. Weldon Bell rode over to the Stroud place at daylight the next morning. He was a tall, thin man of 40 who had lost most of a crop the year before and had been carried on Vane's book for 11 months. And he came up on a horse with no feed in it, and got down at the door of that soddy and took his hat off, and stood there in the cold with his hat in his hand, and said, "Miss Stroud, I was in the schoolhouse Tuesday night." He said. I laughed. He did not try to explain it, and he did not ask her to say it was all right, and afterward she said that was the thing that made her able to bear him. He said, "I have got a wife whose hands are wore through, and I have got 3 children, and one of them is not right. And I have got 61 bushels of corn in a crib I cannot do anything with. And I am asking you to teach me what you told them Tuesday, and I will do whatever work you set me at for as long as it takes." And Almira Stroud said, "Come in out of the cold, Mr. Bell, and put your horse in the barn, there is hay." And then she said, "And go home at noon and bring your wife, because it is women's work at the tub, and there is no use my teaching you and you teaching her wrong." It went through that county in 9 days, and it went the way news actually travels in a settled country, which is not from the top down but sideways, woman to woman, along the lines that nobody had bothered to draw on any map. Ida Bell told Marta Krupa on the Thursday. Marta Krupa, who had ground corn in a coffee mill until her right hand would not close properly, walked 1.25 miles through drifts on the Friday morning with her 2 girls to see it done, and stood in the Stroud yard for 5 hours in the cold without once going in to warm herself, watching the color of the kettle and the way Almira took a kernel out on the paddle and rubbed it. Marta Krupa told her cousin at the Bohemian settlement on the flat, and the Bohemians, who had been eating hulls and grit all winter with a kind of stoic misery, had 6 kettles going by Sunday, and one of them was a copper wash boiler that had come from Pilsen in a crate in 1874. Marta also told Hannah Ostergaard, and Hannah came on the Saturday with her husband and their sledge because their smallest, a girl of 1 year and 9 months, had been sick 11 days and would not take anything but broth, and Almira gave them a crock of the wet hominy out of the cellar and showed Hannah how to break it fine with the back of a spoon and cook it slow in milk. And that child ate it and kept it down and was walking around the room in 5 days. The Ostergaards were Lutheran and stiff and formal people, and Nils Ostergaard came back the following week and stood in the yard and made a speech he had plainly been working on, in careful English, about neighbors, and gave Almira Stroud a smoked ham he had been saving for Easter, and she took it because she understood exactly what it would have cost him to have it refused. By the 28th of February, there were 11 families making hominy in that valley. By the 6th of March, there were 34, and the count of 34 is not a guess, because Cordelia Doak kept a list in the back of her household book with the name of every family and the date somebody from it had been taught and by whom. And that book is still in existence, and a photograph of the page hung for many years in the county courthouse at Broken Bow. Almira ran the whole of it out of Josiah's yard for the first 11 days, and it nearly finished her. She was up at 4 to fire the pit and set the leach, and she had 2 kettles going by 7 and a tub line of 4 wash tubs in the yard by 9, and there were women in that yard from breakfast to dark. Some come to learn, and some come to work, and some come plainly, because they had been hungry a long time, and there was a place now where food was being made. She taught the same lesson 40 times over. She taught it in the same order every time, because she had been taught that way herself by a man who believed that a thing worth doing was worth doing in an order. What wood, how to burn it, how to pack the leach, how to try the lye with an egg, how much lye to how much corn, how to know the minute by the coat coming off the kernel, how to wash it, and how to know it was washed. That last was the one she hammered at, because that was the one that would hurt somebody if it were done badly. 8 washings, she said, and then 2 more, and rub it hard between your hands each time, and taste it, and if there is any slick or any bite at all on the back of your tongue, you wash it again. She would not let a woman go home from that yard until she had washed a batch under Almira's eye and tasted it, and had it approved. In 34 families that winter, and in more than 80 by the end of March, and in every kitchen those women taught afterward, there was not one person made sick by it. That fact is worth more than all the rest of the story, and it did not happen by luck. It happened because a woman who had been laughed at in a schoolhouse decided that the one thing she could not afford was a single bad batch. On the 24th of February, the arrangement outgrew the yard, and it was Reverend Doak who came out and said so. He came out with Cordelia in a borrowed cutter, and he stood and watched the line of tubs and the women rubbing corn in cold water with their sleeves pinned and their skirts wet through. And he said that there was a schoolhouse in Fairbank with a corn burner in it and a well at the door and a floor a person could scrub, sitting empty because the district had dismissed the term in January, and that if Miss Stroud would consent to move her works into it, he would have the stove going before she got there. And Almira said she would want 2 more kettles and every wash tub in the county and somebody with a team hauling ash all day. So the Fairbanks School became a hominy works from the 25th of February until the 22nd of March in the year 1883, and any person in that county over 60 years old could tell you about it half a century later, because they had been children in it. The desks were carried out and stacked against the north wall. The stove burned day and night. There were 4 kettles on it and 2 more on a hearth of brick and clay built out in the schoolyard under a lean-to of canvas, and a wooden trough leached 40 feet from the door with a boy detailed to pour water into it all day, and a line of tubs down the length of the room where the washing was done, and a wagon coming in every hour with corn from somebody's crib and going out with ash barrels to be filled. There was a woman at every station, and the stations rotated at noon so that no one pair of hands was in cold water the whole day. There was a slate on the wall with the names of the families and the day each was to send for its share, and Cordelia Doak kept it. And in the middle of that room, from before light until after dark 26 days running, stood Elmira Stroud with a wooden paddle, testing kettles. She did the work of 4. That is not a figure of speech. There was one woman in that county who could tell by the color and the smell of a kettle within 2 minutes when it was ready, and she moved from one to the next all day long, and when she was not doing that she was on her knees at the leach with an egg in her hand, or teaching some frightened girl to rub corn, or writing out with a pencil for somebody's husband exactly how many bushels of hedge ash 100 bushels of corn would take. She wore herself down to the bone of her own stubbornness that winter, and slept 4 and 5 hours a night for 26 nights, and gained a callus across the inside of her right hand from the paddle that she carried the rest of her life. And she was, for the first time in her 29 years, in a room full of people who had stopped seeing her body at all. That is a thing that ought to be said carefully, because it was not a conversion and it was not an apology. Not yet. What happened in that schoolhouse was simpler and in some ways more honest than either. There was a job to be done that only one person knew how to do, and everybody's children were in it, and so when Elmira Stroud came across that floor with a paddle in her hand, the women got out of her way and did what she told them, and when she said the lie wanted another run through the ash, nobody argued. Verna Kinnery came on the 2nd of March. She came alone, driving herself, which was not her habit, and she stood in the door of that schoolhouse for a while before anybody noticed her. She was the wife of the man who had made Elmira stand on the stock scale at the shipping pens in front of 9 men and had read the number out loud. She was a proud woman and a hard one, and she had 4 children, and the youngest of them had been sick since the middle of January. She stood in that door and waited to be spoken to, and Elmira Stroud looked up from a kettle and saw her, and there was a moment there that half the women in that room were watching without appearing to. And Elmira said, "Mrs. Kinnery, take off your coat and roll up your sleeves. We are behind at the 3rd tub." That was all. That was the entire reckoning between those 2 women, then and ever, and Verna Kinnery worked at the 3rd tub that day until dark, and came back the next day and the next. And she was there 21 of the 26 days, and she never once mentioned the scale, and neither did Elmira. Some things get settled in a room like that without being said, and the ones that get settled that way are the ones that hold. Not everybody came. There were 4 or 5 households in that district that held out into the 2nd week of March, and the reasons were the reasons people always have, which are pride and fear and the particular stubbornness of a man who has said a thing out loud in front of other men. The hardest of them was Ruth Hollenbeck, who farmed a half-section on the North Tableland with a wife and 5 children, and who had stood up in the schoolhouse meeting on the 17th of February and said, over the noise, that he had heard of a man in Iowa who had gone blind from lye, and that he would not have the stuff in his house, and that if it came to it, he would kill a beef and eat beef till the grass came. He did kill the beef. He killed it in the last week of February, and it fed them for a while, and it went bad on him in the first thaw. Because you cannot keep a whole beef through a warm turn of weather in a sod house with no ice, and by the 6th of March the Hollenbecks were eating cracked corn and hulls 3 times a day like everybody else had been in January. And the difference was that by then everybody else had quit. Ellen Hollenbeck came to the schoolhouse on the 7th. She came on foot 4 miles at 7 in the morning, and she did not come in. Cordelia Doak found her standing around the corner of the building out of the wind with her hands in her shawl, and brought her in. And she would not sit down and would not take coffee, and stood in the middle of that steaming room and said, plainly, that her husband had forbidden it, and that she had come anyway, and that her 2 youngest had not been right in 3 weeks. And could she be told how it was done? The room went quiet in a way that a room does when everybody in it understands at once that a woman has walked 4 miles to disobey her husband. Elmira Stroud put down the paddle and washed her hands, and took Ellen Hollenbeck to the 3rd tub and taught her the whole of it from the 1st ash to the 10th washing, standing beside her for 4 hours, and did not once ask her about her husband or say a single word about what had been said in the meeting. And at the end of it she filled a crock and set it in a basket and put a lid on it and said, "Take this home now, because the teaching is no good to your children tonight, and this is." And then she said the other thing, which is the sentence that Ellen Hollenbeck repeated to her own granddaughters 60 years later. She said, "And if he throws it out, come back tomorrow and I will fill it again, and I will keep filling it as long as you keep walking." He did not throw it out. What he did was worse in the short run and better in the long one. He ate it without a word for 4 days, and would not have it named at his table, and the children got their color back. And on the 5th day, which was the 11th of March, the blizzard came and shut that family into a sod house on an open tableland for 4 days, with the wind out of the northwest at a temperature nobody could measure, because the glass at the store did not go low enough. When it blew out, Rufe Hollenbeck dug his door open and hitched his 1 sound horse and came down off that tableland to Fairbank, and he did not go to the store, and he did not go to the church. He came to her door at the schoolhouse. He was a man of 46 who had never in his life apologized to anybody, and he stood in the doorway of that hot steaming room in his coat with the snow melting off him, holding his hat in both hands, in front of 30 women who all knew exactly what he had said in that same room on the 17th of February. And he could not get any words out for a while. And then he said that his wife had walked 4 miles in the cold to a place he had forbidden her to go, and that his children had eaten because she did, and that he had been sitting in a sod house for 4 days with the wind going over it, thinking about the kind of man who would let it come to that. He said, "I said you would blind somebody." He said, "I have got no excuse but ignorance, and I have got 5 children who are alive on the strength of a thing I called poison in front of 40 men. And Elmira Stroud, who had by then not had a full night's sleep in 3 weeks, looked at him for a moment and did the only thing that would let that man walk back out of that room able to live in that county afterward, which was to hand him work. She said, "Mr. Hollenbeck, there is a sledge of oak coming up from the river bend within the hour, and there is nobody to cut it." He said, "The saw is against the north wall." He cut wood in that schoolyard until dark, and he came down off the tableland every day for 11 days, and in April he hauled ash for her without being asked, and would not be paid. And in 1904, when he was an old man on a good place with a wire fence and a windmill, he told a state agricultural commission that there was 1 woman in that county who had known in February what 40 grown men had not known in 6 weeks, and that she had never once in 21 years said a word to him about it, and that in his opinion this was the only kind of forgiveness a man ought to be offered, because it left him standing. The thing that nearly stopped it was ash. Corn they had in a quantity that no one could measure. Water was in every well and, failing that, in snow, and there was fuel of a sort in every crib. What the Middle Loop did not have, and had never had, and could not buy, was hardwood, and by the 4th of March, the works at the schoolhouse was burning through better than 9 bushels of good ash a day, and the county had scraped up everything that would make it. They burned the hedgerows first, and there were not many. They burned an old ash wagon tongue, and a broken hickory singletree, and 2 sets of oak bows off a wrecked bobsled. Marta Krupa broke up a chest that had come from Bohemia in 1874 with her mother's initials cut in the lid and carried the pieces to the schoolhouse in her apron and would not discuss it. Hot Prying gave up an apple tree he had nursed along for 6 years on the north side of his soddy, and it was the only apple tree in 11 miles, and he cut it himself in the morning and did not come to the schoolhouse that day. Cottonwood they had in plenty along the river, and cottonwood ash is worth precisely nothing for lye. And Almira had to say so to a great many well-meaning men who had hauled a load in and stood there waiting to be thanked. Soft wood makes no strength. She would take a handful and wet it and let them see the water come off it gray and thin and float an egg in it that sank like a stone and send them away. On the 5th of March she stood in that schoolyard at 7 in the morning and looked at what was left under the tarpaulin, and it was a day and a half of ash, and there were 60 families on Cordelia Doak's slate. And Doss Kinnery came into the schoolyard with his hat off. It is necessary to say who Doss Kinnery was. He ran the biggest outfit in the valley, 4,000 acres deeded and leased, 360 head. He had money in the bank at Broken Bow. He employed 6 men in the summer and 2 through the winter, and one of those 2 was Cade Merrow. He had the stock scale at the shipping pens, and it was Doss Kinnery who had ordered a woman up onto it for the amusement of 9 men. And it was Doss Kinnery who had laughed at the box social loud enough to be heard at the back wall. And it was Doss Kinnery who had said in the schoolhouse meeting that he would not poison his children on the say-so of anybody. His wife had by then been washing corn at the 3rd tub for 3 days. His youngest boy had eaten hominy and milk for 4 days running and had got up off the bed and gone out to look at the horses. He came into that yard in front of 30 women and stood with his hat in both hands and waited until Almira Stroud had finished at the kettle and come over, and he said, "Ma'am, I have got something you need." And what Doss Kinnery had was the Deverell Mill, not the mill itself. What he had bought 4 years before in a transaction the county thought shrewd and Deverell thought otherwise, was the ground on both sides of the river at the bend, including the dam, the timber cribbing, the mill yard, and everything on it, subject to Deverell's lease of the mill house. That cribwork dam was built of oak. There were, in the wreck of it lying in and along that river, better than 200 oak timbers, 12 inches square and up to 22 feet long, cut in Missouri and rafted and freighted up in 1871 when there was money for such things, and they had been under water 11 years, and they were the single largest body of hardwood within 26 miles of Fairbank. He said, "It is broke up, and half of it is in the ice, and it will want cutting out with axes, and it will burn wet and sullen for a week before it dries." He said, "I have been told there is enough oak in that wreck to make ash for this whole valley till June." He said, "Take it. It is yours, and I will send my 2 men and my 4 horses and my sledges to haul it, and I will pay them while they do it." And then Doss Kinnery, standing in his own hat in a schoolyard, said the other thing, which nobody had asked him for. He said, "Miss Stroud, I made you get up on my scale." He said, "My wife told me about it Tuesday night. I did not know she knew." He said, "I have got no way to take it back." And Almira Stroud, who had walked 3 miles home from that scale and eaten no supper, looked at him a moment and then said the thing that people in that county quoted for 50 years, some of them getting it wrong and making it prettier. She said, "Mr. Kinnery, I have got 60 families on that slate and a day and a half of ash." She said, "Bring me the oak. We can have the rest of this conversation in June if you still want it." And she turned around and went back to the kettle, and Doss Kinnery put his hat on and went and got his sledges. They cut oak out of that ice for 9 days. It was the coldest work anybody did that winter, and it was done by men, and it is fair to say so, because there were parts of that season that were women's work at the tubs, and there were parts that were 4 men and a crosscut saw standing in a river in March, and both got done. Cade Merrow was one of them. He had by then worked out his own place in the thing, and the way he worked it out is worth telling because a good many men would have got it wrong. He was engaged to be married to the woman running it. He was a man of 34 who had been raised to believe that a man stands in front, and there is no doubt at all that in the second week of the works there were 3 or 4 men in Fairbank who assumed, without particularly thinking about it, that Merrow was the one directing the business out at the schoolhouse and that his intended wife was doing the cooking. He put that down flat, twice, in public, in a way that cost him something. The first time was at the livery when a man said something admiring to him about his getting the county fed, and Cade Merrow said, plainly and in front of 6 people, that he hauled ash and cut wood and did what he was told at the schoolhouse the same as any other hand, and that the woman who had the whole of it in her head was Almira Stroud, and that if any man wanted to know whether the corn in his kettle was done, he had better ask her, and not him. The second time was to Emmett Vane, over the counter, in the middle of March, and he said less, and it landed harder. What Cade Merrow did that winter was haul. He hauled ash and oak and corn and tubs and water in a wagon and on a sledge 12 and 14 hours a day, in weather that killed 2 horses in that county, and he did it for a woman he had spent his last dollar on in October, and he never once tried to take the front of it. And then, on the 11th of March, the blizzard came. It came out of the northwest at 2 in the afternoon with no more warning than a change in the light, and it blew 90 hours. It was the last real punch of that winter, and in some ways it was the worst, because people were worn thin by then, and because it caught the works spread out over 3 miles of country with wagons on the road. Nobody in that valley died in it. There were 4 counties on the loop where somebody did. Cade Merrow spent the first night of it in a hay pile with a team, having got them into the lee of a stack when he could no longer see the horse's ears, and came in at 11 the next morning, frozen to the color of a plum and unable to speak for an hour, and slept 4 hours in the schoolhouse and went back out. 11 women and 9 children were in the schoolhouse when it hit, and they stayed in the schoolhouse for 4 days. And they kept the kettles going the whole time because the corn burner had to be fed anyway, and there was corn, and there was water, and, by the mercy of the Almighty and the foresight of one woman, there was 11 days of oak ash under a tarpaulin against the north wall, hauled in out of the river ice by Doss Kinnery's sledges and stacked there on the 9th and 10th of March. They made hominy through the whole blizzard. When it blew out on the 15th, there were 62 crocks standing filled along the wall under the blackboard, and the men who came in on snowshoes to see whether their wives were alive found them alive, and found the school hot and steaming and smelling of corn, and found a very large woman asleep, sitting upright on a bench against the wall with a wooden paddle still in her hand. And every one of those men took his hat off in the doorway without being asked to, and stood there in the wet and the steam and did not say anything at all. There is a set of numbers from that march that got written into the back of Cordelia Doak's household book in pencil, and they are worth setting down, because they are the plainest answer to anybody who wants to call this a sentimental story. Between the 19th of February and the 22nd of March, the works at the Fairbank School and the kitchens it taught put up something over 900 bushels of shelled flint corn as hominy. 900 bushels of hard corn comes out of the kettle and the wash tub at better than 2,000 bushels of food, which is a figure that means nothing until it is set beside the other one, which is that there were 241 people in that district, and that a grown man working can be kept on about a bushel of hominy a month with something on the side. They had, by the end of March, a good deal more food in that valley than the valley could eat before harvest, made out of the exact same corn that had been standing in the same cribs on the day of the county meeting, when 42 men had sat in a schoolhouse and concluded that there was nothing to be done. And they had it made by a method that had cost the county nothing whatever except ashes, water, firewood, and work. Nobody paid $1 for it. Nobody rode anywhere for it. It had been 3 miles up the section line the whole time. Almira did 2 more things in March that mattered nearly as much as the hominy, and both of them came out of the same leech and the same head. The first was keeping. Wet hominy in a crock in a cold cellar will go over in 8 or 9 days, and in the last week of February she was making more of it than the valley could eat before it spoiled. And she stopped everything for half a day and set up the drying, which is the way it was done in Ohio, and the reason her father could make a hogshead of it in October and eat off it in April. They spread the washed hominy on clean sheets and on the desk lids stacked against the north wall of the school, and dried it hard by the stove and in the wind until the kernels rattled, and then it would keep a year in a sack in a dry place and swell up again in the kettle when it was wanted. And dried hard it could be pounded. And this is where the samp mortar came back into the story after 20 years. Elmira had Ott Prine and 2 others burn out the middle of a cottonwood stump behind the school, deep and smooth, and rig a maul on a spring pole out of a young ash, so that a woman or a boy could work the pounder up and down with one hand all day without breaking her back, and they pounded dried hominy in it. And what came out was samp and grits and sifted through a flour cieve, a coarse sweet meal that would bake. The Bell children ate hominy bread with sorghum on it on the 28th of February, and Ida Bell said afterward that it was the first thing she had been able to give them in 6 weeks that they had asked for a second helping of. So the county got bread again, in a manner of speaking, without a mill and without a railroad and without a pound of wheat. And old Ferris Toole, who had been in Kentucky as a boy, ate a piece of it and laughed until he had to sit down and said that he had come 400 miles west and 40 years forward to get exactly what his mother used to set in front of him on a Tuesday. The second thing was soap. It had not occurred to anybody in Fairbank in January that they were going to run out of soap, and by the first week of March they had, because soap came in bars in a crate on the same freight that had not come since December. And by then there were 60 families and 1 schoolhouse trying to keep clean while making food in an open room. And a woman had to wash corn 10 times in a tub with hands that had been at a hearth all day. Elmira had the lie. She had a leach running better than a tub a day, and she was using only part of it for the corn. So she boiled soap. She boiled it in the small kettle in the schoolyard with the trimmings and the cracklings out of everybody's pork barrel and the tallow off 2 beeves Das Kinnery had killed, and she made better than 90 gallons of soft soap in 11 days, and it went out of that schoolyard in every kind of vessel the county owned, a bucket to a family, and it did not cost anybody a cent. There is a woman in that county who kept the last of hers in a stone jar on a shelf for 40 years without using it, and gave it to the Historical Society in 1922 with a card tied to it in her own handwriting that said what it was and who made it. Dr. Ansel Prue got back into Fairbank on the 20th of March, over a road that was still 4 feet deep in the draws, expecting to find what he had left. He wrote the account himself, so it is not the county's story about itself, and it is worth quoting for 1 line. He found the sickness gone out of 9 families. He found the sore mouths healed in the children he had been worried about and the smallest of the Ostergaards, whom he had honestly not expected to see again, walking around a kitchen with a piece of hominy bread in her fist. He wrote that he had been given, in the schoolhouse, a bowl of hominy with milk on it, and had eaten it standing up, and had asked for the receipt to send to a colleague in Lincoln. And he wrote, "I have practiced 11 years and have never seen a whole district's health turned around in 5 weeks, and I take no credit for any part of it, the credit being entirely due to a farmer's daughter of this county who knew a thing that I did not know, and that no man here would hear from her until they were desperate enough to listen." Emmett Vane came to the schoolhouse on the 21st of March. He had not come before. He had sent things, which was his way. He had sent up his own 2 wash tubs in the last week of February and 140 pounds of salt, and had said nothing about either, and Cordelia Doak had put both on the slate anyway. But he had not come, and everybody had noticed, and there was a general understanding in the county by then that Emmett Vane was going to have to do something, and that nobody envied him. He came on a Wednesday afternoon while there were about 30 people in the room, and he stood inside the door with his hat in his hand and did not go up to her. He waited until Almira had come away from the kettles, and then he said, in front of everybody, and not quietly, that he had a thing to say, and would say it once, and then get out of the way of the work. He said that he had stood in that room in February and made a joke at the expense of Miss Almira Stroud when she had got up and told this county exactly how to feed itself. He said that he had also made a joke about her at a church box social in October, and another one at his own counter more times than he could count, and that he had been telling jokes about that woman in his store for 2 years because they got a laugh, and that he had never once thought about it further than that, and that he saw now that he had been the one who made it all right for everybody else in this town to do it. He said, "I told the biggest lie in this county, and I told it for 2 years, and the lie was that Almira Stroud was a figure of fun." He said, "She was right in this room on the 17th of February, and she was right about the ashes and the lie and the corn and the washing, and she was right about every part of it, and I laughed at her. And 40 of you laughed with me, and my grandchildren ate off that woman's kettle in this schoolhouse 3 days ago." And then he said, "I am asking your pardon in public because I did it in public. It is not much of an apology, and it is all I have got." Almira Stroud heard him out. She did not say it was all right, because it was not, and she was not a liar. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Vane." She said, "There is a wagon of ash coming from the river at 4 o'clock, and I have got nobody to unload it." And Emmett Vane, who was 51 and had a bad hip and had not done a day's physical labor in 11 years, took off his coat in that schoolhouse and went out and waited in the yard for that wagon, and unloaded 11 barrels of oak ash himself, and came in every day for the last 2 weeks of the works and did whatever the women told him to do. Nobody ever told that joke again in Fairbank, not in the store, not in either saloon, not at a branding or a wake or a threshing. There are men who tried it once that spring, out of habit, the way a man reaches for a tool he has always kept in the same place, and found the room go quiet on them, and did not try it twice. That is not the same as saying the county became a kind place overnight, because it did not, and there were people in it who went right on being what they had been. But the particular joke about the woman and the supper box and the 2 men and the mule went out of Fairbank in the spring of 1883 and never came back, and it did not go because anybody was scolded or preached at. It went because every soul in that valley had stood in a schoolhouse and eaten out of her kettle. The plow engine came through the Deacon Hill cut on the afternoon of the 14th of March, and the first freight in 11 weeks stood at the Fairbank siding on the 16th with Emmett Vane's whole winter order in it. 11 barrels of flour, and 4 of sugar, and coffee, and salt, and soap in crates, and a case of oranges that had frozen solid in December and come back out of the boxcar as 11 dozen brown ruined things that he gave to the children anyway. There were 40 people at that siding. And the strange thing, the thing Vane told for years afterward with a kind of wonder, was that they did not fall on the flour. He had expected a rush and had made a plan for the rationing of it, and instead he sold 4 barrels in the first week and had 2 left at the end of April. Because by the middle of March there was not a family in that valley that was short of anything to eat, and hominy and samp and hominy bread and soft soap had become, in 5 weeks, simply what those people had in the house. Some of them went back to white bread when it came. A good many of them never entirely did. There were kitchens on the Middle Loop where a kettle of hominy was made every second week for 40 years after that winter, in good times and in bad ones, and there were grandchildren who grew up thinking of it as an ordinary Nebraska dish, which by then it was. The reckoning with Almira Stroud began about the 20th of March, and it took the better part of 2 months, and it was the most awkward business that county ever transacted, because there was no name for what she was owed and no machinery for paying it. She would not take money for the teaching. She was immovable about it, and it caused real distress in some quarters. Nils Ostergaard came with $11 in silver in a sock and had it refused and went home offended and had to be talked around by his wife. Marta Krupa tried to give her the 2 little gold earrings she had come from Bohemia with. Almira said the same thing to every one of them, which was that her father had taught her for nothing, and that she had taught it in a public schoolhouse, and that a thing like that was not for sale and never had been in her family. What she would take, she said, was work, and she had a considerable quantity of that in mind. Because Almira Stroud had spent 26 days standing over 6 kettles in a schoolhouse, and somewhere in the middle of it, in the way of a person raised by a man who could not look at a hillside without reckoning what it might yield, she had begun to see the shape of a business. The valley had 400,000 bushels of corn a year that was not worth 11 cents to haul. The railroad ran 11 miles east. Hominy dried hard would keep a year in a sack and travel anywhere, and samp and hominy meal likewise. There were mining camps in the Black Hills and construction camps on 2 lines and army posts at Robinson and near Brara, and every one of them was buying food in sacks from 1,000 miles away. And she knew, better than anybody west of the Missouri that spring, how to turn hard yellow field corn into a food a man will eat with a spoon and thank you for. She talked it over with Cade Merrill for a week in April, sitting on the step of his broken-down soddy at the Hollis place with the wind coming off the new grass, and then the 2 of them went to see Doss Kinnery. What she wanted was the mill bend. She wanted the mill house standing on its stone footing with no wheel worth mending, and the yard around it, and the wreck of the Oak Crib Dam in the water, and the right to the water when there was a dam again, and she wanted it in her own name. Kinnery said she could have it, and he said it in the way a man says a thing he has been waiting all spring to be allowed to say. And then he made the mistake of adding that there would be no price on it. And Almira Stroud said no. She said it kindly, and she did not move an inch. She said that if she took that ground as a gift, there would be men in this county saying inside of a year that Doss Kinnery had set her up, and that in 10 years it would be the whole of what anybody remembered, and that she had been talked about in this town on other people's terms for 2 years and 8 months and was finished with it. She said, "I will pay you what it is worth, and I will pay it out of hominy." And she did. The paper was drawn in Broken Bow on the 2nd of May in the year 1883 in the name of Almira Stroud, Soul, and the price was $640, payable 4 years. And Cade Merrill's name is nowhere on that instrument and never was, and that was her doing and not his, and he told a man in 1909 that it had been the second smartest thing that ever happened to him and that he had had no part in either. They were married on the 10th of June, 1883, in the Fairbank Church by Reverend Tobias Doak at 4 in the afternoon. She wore a dress of gray-blue poplin that she had made herself, and Cordelia Doak did her hair, and Lavina Stroud, who had once said that nobody would think a thing of it if Almira stayed home from the social, stood up with her and cried through the whole ceremony in a way she would not discuss afterward. The church was full, and there were people standing at the back and out the door and down the steps, which was not usual for a wedding out there, and Ida Bell counted 11 families that had come more than 9 miles. The wedding dinner was in the schoolyard because no house would hold it, and Doss Kinnery gave the beef. And Emmett Vane sent up everything on the store's shelves that could be eaten and would not take a cent for any of it, and old Ferris Toole played a fiddle sitting on a chair with a blanket over his knees. And Almira Merrow danced twice that evening, which was the first 2 times in her life, once with her husband and once with her brother, and the second dance was the one that made the older women cry, because Josiah Stroud had gone to every social in that county for 2.5 years and had never once asked his sister to stand up with him, and he knew it, and she knew it. And neither of them ever said a word about it as long as they lived. The works at the mill bend went up that summer. She had 11 men on it in July, and every one of them was working out a debt that she had refused to have paid in money, and she kept the accounts herself in a ledger with a marbled cover. They put a new crib in the gap of the dam with the sound oak out of the old one. And they built a kettle house of stone with 6 kettles set in brick under one roof and a chimney at each end, and a leach house behind it with 9 hoppers in a row, where a man could pack ash by the wagon load, and a drying floor with sliding shutters the whole length of the south wall, and a granary and a wash house with a pump. In September of 1883, Almira Merrow shipped her first freight out of the Fairbanks siding. 211 sacks of dried hominy and 40 of sap consigned to a wholesale house in Deadwood, at a price that came to more per bushel of corn than any farmer in that valley had seen out of an elevator in 4 years. She bought the corn at home. That was the part that changed the county. She paid 19 cents a bushel at her own door in a year when the elevator at Broken Bow was paying 11 and charging the hauling, and she took it from anybody who brought it, in any quantity. And she paid on the day, and there were 41 farmers on the Middle Loop who put their whole crop through that kettle house in the fall of 1884 and got out of debt on it. Weldon Bell, who had ridden over at daylight in February with his hat in his hand, ran her leach house for 19 years. Ida Bell had charge of the wash floor and 11 women under her, and when a new girl came on it was Ida who taught the 10 washings, and Ida who made her taste it, in the order Almira had taught it. In the order Elias Stroud had taught his daughter in Ohio in a yard on the Scioto Bottom in the 1860s, and none of it was ever written down until a woman from the State Historical Society came out with a notebook in 1926 and got it, at last, from the mouth of a very large old woman sitting in a rocking chair on the porch of a stone house at a bend in the river, who told the whole of it in an hour and a quarter without once having to stop and think. The bell came in September. The box social in October of 1882 had made $51.40 from 40 boxes, and $31 from one, and the fund had sat at $82.40 all through the winter in a lard pail in Reverend Doak's cupboard while the county ate stock feed, and in July of 1883, without any meeting being called about it, men began coming into the store and putting money on the counter for the bell, and most of that money came out of corn that had been sold at 19 cents a bushel at a kettle house at the bend of the river. The balance was made up in 9 weeks. The bell came out of St. Louis by rail to the Fairbanks siding on the 11th of September, 610 pounds of it. And it took 9 men and a borrowed derrick 2 days to get it up into the belfry, and it was rung for the first time on Sunday the 16th, and it could be heard, as Reverend Doak had promised the congregation it would be, 9 miles out over open country, at the Ostergaard place, and at the Kruppus's on the flat, and at the Hollis place where a man was building a barn, and at the bend of the river where a woman came out of a stone kettle house with her sleeves pinned back and stood in the yard and listened to it with a paddle in her hand. Emmett Vane drove out to that kettle house on the last day of September. He came out alone in the store's spring wagon, and he had a lead pencil in his vest, and he stood in the yard with his hat in his hand, which is how everybody came to her door that year, and he said what he had come to say without any patter, because he had lost the habit. He said the church was holding the fall social on the 3rd Saturday of October, the same as always, and that the money this year was for the school, and that he had been the auctioneer at every sale in that county for 11 years, and had stood up in front of it in October and made a joke that he was going to be paying for the rest of his life, and that he could not do it again, and would not, and that he had come to ask her to sell the boxes. Almira Merrow looked at him a good while. She was 29 years old, near 30, a very large woman in a work apron with lye stains on the hem of it, and she owned $640 worth of Riverbend and 11 men's wages and a name that was on a freight consignment in Deadwood. And she stood in her own yard and thought about it, and she said, "I will do it on one condition, Mr. Vane, and the condition is this: not one word gets said from that table about any box on it except what it is made of and what it might be worth." She said, "No jokes. Not about a big one, and not about a little one, and not about whose it might be." He said, "No jokes," and gave her the pencil out of his vest, and he never took it back. She sold the boxes on the 3rd Saturday of October in the year 1883 in the Fairbank Church, in front of the whole county, and the people who were there as children remembered it their whole lives, because there had never been an auctioneer in that town like her, and there never was again. She had a voice that carried without being raised, and she knew the value of everything anybody had ever made with her hands, and she sold 47 boxes in an hour and 20 minutes and got more for them than Emmett Vane had ever got in his life. She held up a little tin box tied with grass twine that belonged to a girl of 19 who had come out from Ohio that spring with nothing, and who was standing at the back of the church with her hands knotted in her skirt, and she turned it in the lamplight and said, "This box was made out of a syrup can and a piece of string, and whoever did it lined the inside with a page out of a catalog so that the lid opens onto a picture of a garden, and I will not sell it for less than $3. It brought $3.75. She sold a plain, unpainted crate for $2.50 and made the room understand it was worth it. And when the 47th box was gone off the plank table, Cade Merrow came up the aisle from the back wall carrying the 48th. It was a clean pine box, planed and sanded and rubbed with beeswax until the grain came up gold, with a wreath of oak leaves on the lid done in gold-brown paint by a brush worn down to 9 hairs. And there was not one soul in that church who did not know it on sight. He had kept it in the bunkhouse and then in the soddy at the Hollis place all that year. He had paid $31 for it, and it was his, and he had never once let it be used for anything, and his wife had known that he had it, and the two of them had never discussed the matter. He set it down on the table in front of her and stepped back. And then he said, to the room and not to her, that he had packed it himself that afternoon badly out of the Kettle House kitchen, and that there was fried chicken in it that he had ruined in the skillet, and a plum cake bought off Cordelia Doak because he could not make one, and that the supper in that box was for whoever bought it, and the money was for the school. He said, "And I will start the bidding at $31. Dos Kennery said 35 before Cade Merrow had finished sitting down. Nils Ostergaard said 40. It went up in 2s and 5s through that church for 11 minutes, and it went up out of the pockets of people who did not have it, and Almira Merrow stood behind the plank table with a lead pencil in her hand and took the bids in a voice that got quieter as the numbers got bigger. Marta Krupa bid. Ott Prine bid, and he had an apple tree to replace. Verna Kennery bid against her own husband and made the room laugh in the way a room is supposed to laugh. Emmett Vane bid 60 and was outbid, and bid 70 and was outbid, and sat down. And it was Weldon Bell who got it, the tall, thin man who had been carried on the store's book for 11 months and had ridden over to Asadi at daylight in February with his hat in his hand, and he got it at $104, which was very nearly 1/3 of everything he had in the world, and there was a silence when the pencil came down, and Elmira Merrow said, "Sold," in a voice that did not carry very well at all. Weldon Bell came up and took the box off the table. He did not open it. He carried it down the aisle to where his own wife was sitting, and he did not stop there either, and he went on to the third bench on the women's side, where Lavina Stroud was holding a boy of 3 years old who had once gone quiet in the way that frightens mothers. And he set that pine box down on the end of the bench, at the very place where a woman had sat 1 year before with her hands folded in her lap while a room laughed at her, and he said, loud enough for the church to hear it, that the supper went with the packer and always had, and that he would eat his where he was welcome, and that this box belonged on this bench. And the county stood up, all of it, benches and back wall and the men in the doorway with their hats in their hands, and it was not applause exactly, or not only that, and it went on a long time, and Elmira Merrow stood behind the plank table in the front of that church and let them do it, and did not cry, because she had made herself a promise about that in Ohio when she was 13 years old, and she had kept it every day since. She kept the works at the Bend for 39 years. The dam was rebuilt in 1886, and a wheel went back in it and drove the pounders and later a set of burrs, and by 1890 there were 22 people on her payroll, and Fairbank had a bank and a second street. And there were 4 other hominy houses on that river by the end of the century, and every one of them was started by somebody who had learned it standing in a schoolhouse with her sleeves pinned back in the winter of 1883. She and Cade Merrow had no children of their own, and they raised 2 of his brothers, and he built her a stone house on the rise above the kettle house with a porch on 3 sides, and he kept the Hollis place and ran cattle on it, and was never rich in his own right, and never appeared to mind it. He died in 1921. She died in 1931 at 77, and there were 300 people at the funeral, and the bell rang for her, and the notice in the county paper called her the woman who fed this valley, which she would have said was an overstatement, since the valley had grown every bushel of it itself, and she had only known what to do with it. The old ash hopper behind Josiah Stroud Soddy stood until 1919, and people took photographs of it. And the thing that lasted longest, longer than the works, and longer than the dam, and longer than anybody who was in that church on either October night, was a piece of arithmetic that the people of that county did among themselves and never wrote down, and never entirely got over. In the fall of 1882, a whole town looked at a very large woman and at 9 days of her work sitting on a plank table, and would not put up $0.25 for it, and laughed. And one man, who had 11 cents to his name, by the time he was done bid $31 on that same table without knowing whose box it was, because he could see the work in it, and he said so out loud. 4 months later, the same town was standing in a schoolhouse eating out of her kettle. He had not been kind to her. That is what she said about it, at the end of her life, to the woman from the State Historical Society who came out with a notebook in 1926, and it is the last thing anybody wrote down in Elmira Merrow's own words. She said, "People always want to tell that story as if the man did me a kindness." She said, "He did not. He looked at what was on the table and he priced it right, and every other soul in that building had priced it at nothing. And the difference between him and them was not that he was kind." She said it was that he was paying attention, and then she said, "And I would have got that corn hulled either way."